We go around the world, focusing on the good news, the bad news, and the challenges that remain. The stories that shaped 2014, tonight on Washington Week.
I'm eager to work with all of you.
President Obama declared 2014 his year of action.
America does not stand still, and neither will I. So wherever and whenever I can take steps without legislation to expand opportunity for more American families, that's what I'm going to do.
But Congress resisted his executive actions, especially after Democrats went down to midterm defeat.
This is a serious breach of our Constitution. It's a serious threat to our system of government.
After Republicans seized control of Congress, for the president, it was to the pen and the phone, on immigration, on climate change, on foreign policy.
America knows how to solve problems. When we work together, we can't be stopped.
From North Korea to Ukraine to Islamic State beheadings, new threats multiplied.
We will follow them to the gates of hell until they are brought to justice.
But there were also new opportunities.
It is time to try working with the Cuban people to build a better and different future.
Health crises as thousands died from Ebola in West Africa, terrorism in Australia and Pakistan, and at home, government scandals at the Secret Service and at the Veterans Affairs Administration.
But treating those to whom we owe the most so callously, so ungratefully, is unconscionable, and we should all be ashamed.
From the Supreme Court to the polling booth to the grand jury, it was also a year for cultural debate, with moves to legalize marijuana and same-sex marriage.
I can't breathe!
As other old debates on race and justice flared anew.
Millions of people throughout our nation have come together, bound by grief and bound by anguish, in response to the tragic deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York City.
Covering all this and more, we look back at 2014 with Dan Baltz, chief correspondent for The Washington Post, Carrie Budoff-Brown, White House correspondent for Politico, Indira Lakshmanan, foreign policy correspondent for Bloomberg News, and Pierre Thomas, justice correspondent for ABC News.
Award-winning reporting and analysis, covering history as it happens. From our nation's capital, this is Washington Week with Gwen Ifill. Once again, from Washington, moderator Gwen Ifill.
Good evening. 2014 is practically over, so it's time for our annual long look back at the year just passed. And what a year! From news of a recovering domestic economy to the rise of an alarming new terror threat, as tensions with Cuba ebb, nervousness about North Korea rise. While domestically, the president's party absorbs a major hit, losing control of the Senate in a $1 billion midterm election. And unrest in major American cities launches matters of race and justice to the front burner. We start this week with the economy, which is ending the year on quite the upswing. This was the president last week.
There is no doubt that we can enter into the new year with renewed confidence that America is making significant strides where it counts. The steps that we took early on to rescue our economy and rebuild it on a new foundation helped make 2014 the strongest year for job growth since the 1990s. All told, over a 57-month streak, our businesses have created nearly 11 million new jobs.
And that was before this week's news that the Dow broke 18,000. So is it too soon for the people at 1600 Pennsylvania, Carrie, to be doing a little victory dance?
You know, that exact question has vexed this White House for years, and that's because of all the false starts, the signs of growth in the economy, only to have a setback. But within the West Wing, there is this feeling for two reasons that they have to start pushing out the message in a more robust, sort of uniformly positive way. One is the numbers are showing strength, sort of in a consistency over a period of months. But the other reason I believe that we're going to see the president talk more forcefully about the economy in the next, few months, certainly at the State of the Union next month, is because he's running out of time to make the case for his presidency and what he did. He's in his last 2 years. It's time for him to start talking about his legacy, the economic legacy on the economy.
No, he doesn't use the L word, it should be said.
He doesn't, but I think we're going to see that change. There is within the West Wing, there's planning underway on how to deal with the legacy question and how he frames it. The economy is a big piece of that, and this week he got more positive news, so I think that sort of fear of really embracing it is fading away. However, there's going to be an asterisk that they're going to continue to put on that message, and that's about wages and that gap that exists. And I think we're going to see him, while in many ways it's the same frame that he's been using. We're making progress, but there's still more work to do. And I think the State of the Union next month, which they're going to be planning over the holidays and really get to work at next month, it's going to be that exact thing.
But at the same time, Dan, the president powered into this post-election period pretty aggressively, ticking off the people who theoretically could be his friends, theoretically, in Congress.
Watching him at the press conference he did before he went off for his holiday vacation, you would not know that this was a president whose party took such a beating in November. I mean, he was very upbeat, he was jaunty, he was joking with some of the people who are here with us tonight. But more importantly, he just started to act aggressively from the minute the election ended. Now, he's been through a number of post-election periods, victories and defeats over his presidency. He's often had a pretty good December. I mean, he had a very good December after the 2010 shellacking. They got a lot done in the lame duck session. The key is what happens next year, how he's able to do things next year, and how he manages the new business with a Congress that's now fully in Republican hands.
One of the things I find most interesting is how this White House tries to deal with the question of job creation. He had a different formulation in his year-end press conference where he talked about the auto industry. And that was something I hadn't heard put quite that way before, which is that he added, 500,000 jobs there alone.
Yeah, I mean, he's talked about the auto industry, and he can claim a very direct link between those job growths and decisions he made early on in his presidency. So I think we're going to continue to see him try to draw links like that. He helped save the auto industry when a lot of people said don't provide them the assistance of the government. But this year is really sort of a tale of 2 years. He had that first 10 months where it was so atrocious for them, and if his year had ended in November, it would have been one of the worst on record. But in the last 6 weeks, the good economic news this week is really, he had a bunch of things that he did, showed a really sort of muscular presidency in the last 6 weeks. But the economy, the positive news on the economy is really sort of as good as they could want to get in terms of, the economy is going to define his presidency after all is said and done, and that strength really not only satisfies them from just sort of a purely, from a standpoint of helping the country, but really, I think personally in the West Wing, they get kind of a joy out of having good economic numbers that's going to put the Republicans on their heels.
But the interesting thing is within his own party, there is a debate about the other part of the economy that is not working, the economy that has left middle-class families struggling, and this kind of rising populism that we've seen and the interest in Elizabeth Warren puts the Democrats in a bind even as the president's trying to make a good case.
Well, let's move on because there's so much else to talk about tonight. We're not going to get it all done. The good economic news did not obscure the year's decisive political setbacks for the White House, as we were talking about. And victories for Republicans in Congress, the president acknowledged the defeat but showed few signs of conciliation, moving almost immediately to unilaterally change immigration law.
To everyone who voted, I want you to know that I hear you. To the 2/3 of voters who chose not to participate in the process yesterday, I hear you too.
I believe that the president continues to act on his own. He is going to poison the well. When you play with matches, you take the risk of burning yourself.
So, did the midterm election results change the political architecture in Washington? You didn't look like it just now, Dan.
Well, it changed the balance of power because the Republicans had a big victory. They got 9 more seats in the Senate. They've now got 54 seats, which is more than most people thought they were going to have. That does change the calculus. I think the other thing that's realistic is that these two sides know one another pretty well, and there's a lot of distrust. It's going to take an enormous amount of work for them to really get together and do things, and it's not clear that either side's prepared to do it. Certainly what the president did in the post-election period was a signal that he's prepared to move on his own whenever he wants to or can. And the Republicans now have the burden, because they have both the House and Senate, of showing that they can govern, and there are a lot of people in the party who are pushing them to do that.
Exactly. So what is their plan? If the president has clearly come out showing his hand that he's going to push, he's going to poke them in the eye when he can, and blame it on them when they screw up, what do they do to set their agenda?
I think they've got two things that they will want to do. One is to satisfy the conservative base in the party, to do some things to undo what the president has done, whether it's on health care or some other issues. They are going to take votes to do that and try to put some things on the president's desk, the XL Keystone Pipeline, for example. They're going to do those things and force him to block them and veto them. But I think the other is they are going to look for some ways, small perhaps, where they can work with the president. I think that Senator McConnell, who's going to be the new majority leader, will want to try to do some things. Trade is one obvious place where the president's policy is closer to the Republicans than to a lot of Democrats. They may be able to do something there. Whether there is any hope on taxes or entitlements is a whole other question.
I don't think there is at all.
Really?
Why do you say that? I think the economic news this week just makes it less likely that there'll be any sort of tough look at deficits and debt reduction. And, I've followed this debate for years with this president and this Congress, and they are just so diametrically opposite. It's a lot of talk, but even when it gets down to it on either side, neither party can make the tough decisions.
But guys, what does the good economic news do to the political dynamic with the Republicans? What does it do there?
Well, they will continue to say, as they have every month in the face of job increases, that this economy is not working for enough people. I think both sides are now keenly focused on middle-class economics and a message for the middle class. So I think that that's where the Republicans will go. They will not acknowledge that fully that the recovery has touched as many people as it needs to.
Now, Dan, of course, the president has acted unilaterally, as he did in immigration. But I wonder how much will he be able to, on his own, achieve some of his remaining central desires for this administration. Closing Guantanamo is one thing I'm thinking of, and the other is climate change, cap and trade. Will he be able to do that alone?
Well, there are limits to what he can do. I mean, that's...
Even though the White House trumpeted this week that the president has signed 80 executive actions, right?
Yes. I mean, there is a lot he can do, but there are limits to what he can do, right. Whether it's on immigration, certainly on climate change. Guantanamo, he's wrestled with that for 6 years and still can't quite figure out the formula. You would have a better sense of that than I would, frankly.
I think they have. I think the Cuba announcement this month took a lot of people. I mean, even though if you followed the issue closely, you knew something was percolating. But sort of the extent and the backstory to what they were doing. I mean, there have to be other things like that they're doing. I think.
Well, on the China climate change announcement was like that too.
Yeah, and I think Guantanamo. I mean, I think that they'll try to figure out a way.
Well, they have just been this week accelerating the transfer of some of the detainees to third countries. The question is, he has to get everyone out of there if he wants to shut the place down, and the U.S. has not been willing to keep some of those detainees in American soil.
Mm-hmm. Was there positioning, Deanna, this sounds like a silly question, for 2016? Was there any positioning that we saw this year that matters going forward?
A little bit. I think the most significant are two things. One was the book tour by Hillary Rodham Clinton, which did not go as well as some of her people had hoped, or I suspect as well as she had hoped. I mean, I think that she went into it thinking it was mostly a book tour, and it was in fact viewed mostly as a opening act for 2016. I think the other important development was the move recently by Jeb Bush, the former Florida governor, to say explicitly he is actively exploring, which I think most people took as him saying, I am going to get into this race. And I think that had the effect of shaking up all of the Republicans a little bit to think about how quickly do I have to move? What does this mean for me? How will it affect fundraising, et cetera?
Well, we know it's going to happen next year, and we're going to be all up in that. But let's go to foreign policy. Take your pick. From Ukraine to Afghanistan, from the Middle East to North Korea to Cuba to Nigeria, there were challenges in every corner of the globe this year. The face of most U.S. involvement in nearly every case was Secretary of State John Kerry, who traveled nearly 350,000 miles to 44 nations just this year. In September, he weighed in on the grave new threat of Islamic State terrorists who were beheading hostages.
When terrorists anywhere around the world have murdered our citizens, the United States held them accountable, no matter how long it took. And those who have murdered James Foley and Stephen Sotloff in Syria need to know that the United States will hold them accountable too, no matter how long it takes.
The hard part, of course, is how is the U.S. holding its enemies accountable, Indira?
Well, I think the major situation that we're looking at now is, of course, North Korea. And with the president coming right out and saying strongly that North Korea was behind this Sony hack and saying that there would be a proportional response from the United States without showing his hand about what that response is going to be. We don't know the timeline. We don't know the menu of options that his advisors are giving to him. You know, it raises a lot of questions. I think with North Korea, it's particularly difficult because they're already a pariah state. They're already completely cut off from the global economy. They are sanctioned to such an extent that I'm not entirely sure that adding more sanctions would really make a difference.
But even, let's think about our friends, for instance, Ukraine. Ukraine was a huge story for many, many weeks this year. And the U.S., obviously, as is often the case, came to its aid.
Right.
In the end, toward what end?
That's right. Well, we just saw a bill that passed through Congress that the president just signed last week, which adds on more money, $500 million in support for Ukraine, including about $300 million of that being for military aid, authorizing it if the president chooses to go in that direction. And the whole point of this law was to give the president the right to give lethal aid to Ukraine. Now, I would have to say that in Congress, there are a lot of people, both Democrats and Republicans, who are much more enthusiastic for lethal aid to Ukraine, much more enthusiastic for NATO membership for Ukraine than either the White House or our allies in the EU. So I think it remains to be seen how far we can go with that. We certainly have hurt the Russian economy with sanctions, and oil prices on their own have really hurt the Russian economy.
Yeah, there's a feeling in the White House that what's happened in Russia with the economy and the ruble and everything else, that things are working and like it's at least contained. It's a sort of a contained problem. It's not spiraling out of control.
But I would say working to what end?
Sure.
I mean, the purpose of sanctions is not meant to be to punish Russia as an end. The purpose of sanctions is also to always get the government to change behavior. And we see that sanctions on North Korea, as one example, have not been effective over the years. They have not stopped their nuclear program. They have not stopped their human rights abuses. And with Russia, likewise, we see that they have not backed down. Now, you can't really prove the negative. The White House would have you believe that they would have gone much further into Ukraine had we not had the sanctions. So at this point, we know we're punishing their economy, but we don't have a horizon yet for whether Putin is going to back down.
You know, on the to what end question, I want to go back to ISIS for a second. A lot of law enforcement officials tell me that beyond the military action to attack that group, their ability to inspire people to go there is a huge issue. We've had more than 12 people this year, even after the beheadings, trying to get into Syria. What does that say?
You're absolutely right, including some minors. I mean, there was a terrific piece in the Washington Post recently that looked at three, a sister and two brothers who were trying to go in there, two of whom were juveniles. I mean, this is a real problem, the inspiration model. And what's been interesting about ISIS is I think they've been even more effective in inspiring foreign jihadis.
Through social media.
Through social media, even more than Al-Qaeda was. When Al-Qaeda came out with that magazine some years ago, Inspire, everyone thought, oh my goodness, goodness, this is how they're getting young people to join. But in fact, ISIS has been even more successful. Now, you mentioned the military response. The U.S. has now, just in the last few months, as of now, done 1,300 military strikes on ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria. That's a lot. And yet we haven't destroyed this group. They're still holding firm in Raqqa and in Mosul. And so the question is, how long is this going to take? I think it's striking that this president was able to pull out of Iraq, which he wanted to do, and now we're back in there again. He's pulling out of Afghanistan, but are we going to be back in there again if the Taliban re-seizes area or a group like ISIS takes power there?
To what extent have they had to reevaluate the timetable for dealing with ISIS?
I think going into this, the top players, at least Secretary Kerry and President Obama, knew that this was going to be a long-term thing. I don't think any of them had illusions that they were going to be able to destroy ISIS in a couple of months. Kerry had said on the record from the start, this is going to take a few years to get this done. But I think what they're reevaluating is how do you use economic tools? How do you stop smuggling of oil over the border? This fall in oil prices is one of the biggest stories of this year, Gwen, and it has affected across the board. It has also hurt ISIS because remember, their $1 to $2 million a day that they were earning was largely on illegal oil sales. So the fall in oil prices has hurt ISIS, it has hurt Russia, it has hurt Venezuela, it has hurt Iran, it has hurt a lot of our adversaries.
Help the American consumer.
It has.
There you go. Finally, as we head into a new year, one huge unresolved dispute comes along for the ride: race and criminal justice. From Ferguson, Missouri to Cleveland to Milwaukee to New York, the Justice Department has found itself entangled time and again in confrontations involving race, politics, and policing. And every time, Pierre Thomas has been in the middle of the story. Now, how many outstanding investigations do we know about that the Justice Department is in because of these kinds of outbreaks right now?
Right now, they're investigating Ferguson still. They're also investigating the case in New York for the choking death. These other cases, Cleveland and Milwaukee, potentially could get federal investigations as well. I've not covered a story in recent memory that has struck this much emotion across the country. You literally have seen thousands of people in major cities across this country, not just one place, but across the country, protesting police action. And part of it is a feeling, particularly in the African American community, that they don't get the benefit of the doubt in dealings with police, and that misunderstandings can result in death. If you look at both Ferguson and also the situation in New York, what's striking is that there was not a call for any kind of violent act. It was a routine police action that turned deadly.
But I wonder whether this doesn't make for a very difficult exit strategy for Eric Holder and an even more difficult one for the president to walk. In that, on one side is the blue line, are police, law enforcement, who, of course, they're sworn to protect and actually lead. And on the other hand are people who clearly they have some sympathies for, who are blocking highways and lying down in the street and doing their best to keep, 100 days of protest alive?
When it got more complicated in the last week or so with the death of those two officers in New York who were assassinated. And the person who is accused of doing it had posted some things which indicated that he was in some way locked into the protest. But he's mainly a person who had a violent past. He's mainly a person who had mental health issues. But again, you had Eric Holder's name tossed into that in terms of the way you've been talking about policing maybe have contributed to that. I think the former
Mayor
governor...
de Blasio, the same thing.
Exactly.
And Pierre, I'm struck by how damaging this is in a way to the president. I mean, this is a guy who ran on post-racial politics. His entire autobiography, his own story, was supposed to be about transcending racial politics in this country, and yet we had a Bloomberg poll out this week that showed 53% of Americans think that race relations are worse now than before Obama took office, and 50% of people, according to Pew, don't even approve of the way he's handling these race problems.
Well, this has been a difficult issue for the first African-American president. Every time the issue of race has come up, even when the president has sought to calm the situation, it's been complicated for him. Again, what it tells us is that in America, race is still a prickly issue with different vantage points, and we see that playing out over and over again.
And I actually don't know if he promised post-racial as much as people expected that.
That's right.
Which has put him in the box.
You know, there's a Gallup poll that just came out this week that asks people what's the big issue or most important issue. That's a constant question in polling. And the Gallup folks said for the first time, the issue of race and racism has risen to be about the same as the economy and dysfunction in government. I mean, it is a new matrix. It's spiked over the last few months as a result of what we've seen, and this gap in perceptions between white America and black America about these issues.
The interesting thing is that clearly, if you look across the board, race relations are better. Look at this table. It tells you that they are better. But there are these pockets, and policing in a race is one of those pockets where there's a difference of opinion based in part on how people have their own dealings with police. I would dare say, Dan, that your interactions with police, if you've had any, have been different from mine. I had one case where I was pulled over, and it was for a minor traffic violation, and suddenly a second police officer appeared with his hand on his weapon, and I was thinking, wait a minute, I'm 2 miles from my house, it's 8 o'clock at night. Why am I being treated like a criminal?
And so many people have stories like that, and that's why this doesn't go away. I know it seems like we barely scratched the surface. It's because we did. But we're going to continue our conversation on our Washington Week webcast extra, where we'll sort through as much as possible of what we didn't get to, including same-sex marriage, the CIA torture report, the change in the nation's state houses, and what happens next when Congress returns to town. That's not too much. It's available now at pbs.org/Washington Week. And while you're online, check out our year-end holiday reading list. Our panelists have great recommendations there for you. And with that, we'll see you next year on Washington Week. Good night.